An unusual tension was being felt in the extraordinarily assembled hall of the United Nations General Assembly. Even the experienced journalists in the press lodge were aware that today's session was different from the others. The normally calm diplomatic explanations and controlled protocol sentences had been replaced by cold looks and suppressed anger. Everyone turned their eyes to two people in the hall: Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Iran's newly elected President Masoud Pezeşkiyan. The agenda of this emergency meeting, held under the shadow of the war, was obvious: the rapidly escalating crisis between Iran and Israel. But no one could have predicted what would happen in a few hours. Netanyahu arrived in New York in the morning, and security measures were increased to the highest level. As his convoy was approaching the UN building, information was being discussed backstage that there had been a brief deconfliction between American security units and Israeli Mossad officers. Seemingly cool and confident, Netanyahu stood out even as he approached the podium in a classic dark blue suit. The stiffness in his walk was noticeable. In the section directly opposite, the pimp was sitting. He was a new figure on the diplomatic scenes. He had only been in the presidential chair a few weeks ago, but he had an unorthodox self-confidence. Western media outlets had begun to describe him as a calm but dangerous chess player. There was neither a faint smile nor any sign of discomfort on his face. He was leaning his hands on the edge of the lectern, watching Netanyahu intently. At 10:05 a.m., the session officially began. After the UN Secretary-General opened the opening with a few diplomatic sentences, Netanyahu took the first word. His thick and distinct voice echoed through the hall. "Mr. President, dear delegates, we will maintain our resolute stance for the security of the Israeli people. We will continue to take all necessary steps against supporters of terrorism, wherever they are." Such statements were expected. But midway through the speech, Netanyahu unexpectedly stiffened. Without naming names, he used statements blaming the Iranian regime. At this moment, a vague smile appeared on the pimp's face. One of the Iranian delegation next to him whispered something in his ear. The pimp shook his head slightly. Most of the cameras did not miss this moment. As Netanyahu finished his speech and returned to his seat, the tension in the hall was at its peak. After a short break, the order of decrees was given to Iranian President Pezeşkiyan. The silence that echoed through the hall was literally the silence before a thunderstorm. The pimp walked to the podium with heavy steps. The translator started talking without even putting on his headphones. In clear and fluent English, looking directly at Netanyahu, he said the following words: "I am speaking here today in front of the eyes of all the peoples of the world. I am here to protect the interests of my country and the peace of our region. However, it is time for some facts to be explained." This sentence created a sudden movement in the hall. Notebooks were opened, cameras focused on the pimp. Netanyahu's advisors were whispering excitedly to each other. The pimp continued his speech. "Over the past week, we have received evidence that some plans belonging to the Israeli government have been leaked by the wrong hands. These are of a nature that can have devastating consequences not only for Iran, but for the entire region." These words almost froze the UN hall. After a few seconds of silence, the pimp pulled out a file from under the lectern. He lifted the file slightly into the air. Then he pointed to the Iranian representative next to him to deliver the documents to the UN Presidential Court. When the documents reached the presidential desk, the astonishment on the faces of the UN officials became visible. The pimp, on the other hand, was continuing his speech. "The documents we present here contain operation plans signed directly by Israeli military commanders. And, more importantly, these documents reveal the existence of a systematic offensive strategy prepared long before the current ongoing war." The silence in the hall was suddenly replaced by a hum. Some delegates turned to each other and started whispering loudly. The pimp was continuing his speech coolly. Netanyahu, on the other hand, was fidgeting on the spot. One of his advisors quickly took out his mobile phone, writing urgent messages. The UN Presidential Court had started to examine the documents quickly. At the same time, urgent headlines were being sent from the phones of reporters from the New York Times, The Guardian, and Reuters. Outside the hall, social media feeds were beginning to fill up with breaking news, one after another. The pimp continued his words with an extremely calm tone. "We have listened carefully to Mr. Netanyahu's speech here this morning. However, the facts revealed by these documents contradict the rhetoric that he and his government have presented to the world public opinion." There was a sudden electricity in the hall. Eyes were turned to Netanyahu. The Israeli Prime Minister maintained his silence at this point, but the tension on his face attracted everyone's attention. The pimp continued by fixing his eyes on Netanyahu for a moment. "We will continue to take all necessary diplomatic and legitimate steps to ensure the security of the Iranian people. However, the disclosure of secret plans that threaten world peace is also our historical and moral responsibility." Meanwhile, the UN Secretary-General leaned forward slightly and quietly whispered something to the Vice President. Security units started a heavy traffic on their radios. Members of the foreign press had begun to flock to the newsrooms outside the hall. He finished his speech by emphasizing international law and UN principles without going into further details about the content of the Pezeşkiyan documents. There were almost gasps in the hall. Netanyahu did not want to speak again for the speech. A senior official from the Israeli delegation immediately left the hall and moved towards the Israeli representative office in the UN building. At that time, CNN's senior diplomatic correspondent turned to the camera and said, "We have not witnessed such a dramatic development for a long time. If the documents presented by Pezeşkiyan are verified, this could lead to the questioning not only of the war, but also of the international legitimacy of the Israeli government." Within hours, the world's media made headlines for Pezeşkiyan's words and the document leak allegations. The Israeli government initially declined to comment. However, according to leaked information from backstage, Netanyahu's team had started organizing an emergency cabinet meeting in Tel Aviv. By the evening, analysis by the New York Times, Le Monde, and Al Jazeera claimed that the first technical verifications on the authenticity of the documents had been made. That night, two hashtags quickly rose to the top on social media platforms: #IsraelLeaks and #Pezeşkiyan Files. News channels around the world were beginning to discuss this incident. And at that time, a small piece of information leaked from Netanyahu's cabinet was spreading from ear to ear. The Prime Minister has given Mossad extraordinary powers to find out how these documents were leaked. However, no one knew at that moment that the course of events had just begun. There were still other undisclosed documents on the pimp's desk. And a bigger disclosure was being prepared to be put in front of the world public. While the New York morning was rapidly turning into the darkness of evening, the diplomatic activity in the city was not decreasing at all. Pezeşkiyan's disclosure at the United Nations General Assembly had become the focus not only of the international press, but also of the intelligence services. Dozens of television vehicles and hundreds of reporters had been broadcasting live in front of the UN building for hours. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Were the documents presented by Pezeşkiyan really authentic, and what more information was to be disclosed? At that time, the Iranian delegation was holding a closed-door meeting chaired by Pezeşkiyan on one of the high floors of the UN building. There were only his most trusted advisors and a few diplomats in the hall. There were documents and digital devices lined up along the table in front of them. The pimp quietly listened to everyone and then spoke in a demure tone. "We haven't shown them all yet. We should carefully watch how the Israeli side will react and how the Western press will handle this issue. If necessary, we will activate the second wave of documents." At the same minutes, an extraordinary security meeting had started at the Israeli Prime Minister's residence in Tel Aviv. Netanyahu, members of his inner cabinet, senior military officials, and the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, had gathered in the hall. The air was heavy. It was the first time Netanyahu had not made a public speech since the files were displayed at the UN. Barnea's voice was sharp and controlled. "Mr. Prime Minister, according to the first technical examinations, the documents are real. The signatures and the internal correspondence style correspond exactly to our standards. We haven't identified the infiltration point yet. At the moment, Mossad is conducting a source search through 7 different channels." Netanyahu hits the table in anger. Whoever did this will be found out as soon as possible. Our reputation is being damaged on the international stage. We should also take into account that the pimp may have more documents in his possession. Later in the evening, the first information leaked to the press in Tel Aviv was that Netanyahu had given Mossad unlimited authority to leak secret operation documents. This news spread to the world's media through Reuters and the Associated Press within a few hours. Middle East expert analysts said that the incident would not only be limited to the war tensions between the two countries, but could also change the diplomatic decencies. At around 3 o'clock in the morning in New York, activity began on the floor where the Iranian delegation was located. One of Pimp's closest advisors had a brief meeting with the special messenger. After this meeting, a short but striking statement was served to major international media organizations. Mr. President Pezeşkiyan will hold a second press conference later in the day. The sharing of new documents is on the agenda. This development has almost created an earthquake effect in the UN building. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera reporters were trying to contact the Iranian delegation to find out the time of the second meeting. On the Israeli side, there was a state of alarm. Netanyahu's chief of staff sent an urgent instruction to the Permanent Mission of Israel in New York early in the morning. Bilateral meetings with Western ambassadors should be arranged before Pezeşkiyan's press conference, and the narrative that Iran was waging a propaganda information war should be spread. At 11 o'clock in the morning, preparations for the second meeting began in the Great Hall of the UN building. The invitation was made open to representatives of UN member states and all accredited reporters of the press. The hall was completely full. Even the foreign ministers of many countries participated personally. It was an unusual situation. Normally, there would be ambassador-level participation in such meetings. At exactly 12 o'clock, the pimp entered the hall with heavy steps. He had only 3 advisors with him. In the front row, the Israeli delegation sent by Netanyahu was waiting intently. The pimp went straight to the podium and started his speech. The interest shown by the world public opinion after the documents we presented yesterday is a clear indication of the deep concern for regional peace. Today is the time to share more extensive and detailed information here. While the pimp was continuing his speech, new documents began to be reflected on the screens. Among the images were internal correspondence of the Israeli Defense Ministry, operational codes, and, most strikingly, records of deceptive conversations with some NATO allies. The pimp formed the following sentence. These documents clearly show that certain allies were informed and certain negotiations were conducted months before the start of the war. There is a clear violation of international law. The atmosphere in the hall changed in an instant. Some Western ambassadors were taking notes with a frown. Others were looking at each other. 2 diplomats from the American delegation delivered a note to the Presidential Council. The Israeli delegation, on the other hand, was completely silent. At this time, the cameras of the international press were going on air one after the other, and the Pezeşkiyan Leaks decal was climbing to the top of the world agenda again on social media platforms. Just then, another urgent instruction came from Netanyahu's headquarters. It was decided that the Israeli foreign minister would hold an emergency press conference in Washington. The aim was to attract the global public to their point of view. However, the pimp would overshadow this effort with his next move. Towards the end of the second meeting, Pimp announced that they would officially hand over some of the documents to international media organizations. Not only that, he also called on the UN Secretary-General's office to establish an International Independent Review Commission. This proposal caused serious repercussions among the European and Latin American delegations. The following comments had begun to spread among diplomats backstage at the UN deck. If these documents are fully verified, serious responsibility against international law may arise not only for Israel, but also for some Western allies. As the clock ticks down, tensions have escalated on the Netanyahu front. The Mossad report, which passed from Tel Aviv to New York, contained findings that the leak probably came from a lower level of the Israeli Defense Ministry. However, the most shocking information was that the leak reached Pezeşkiyan not only through an intelligence operation originating from Iran, but also through some independent journalists in Europe. Discussions about how Pezeşkiyan obtained this information had spread to international security circles. Urgent communication traffic between American and French intelligence officials had started, and an extraordinary meeting had been agreed at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, the New York Times and Le Monde announced the result of their initial reviews of the documents they had obtained. The documents seemed largely authentic. In other words, what the pimp said was largely confirmed. This wave of news also had a shocking effect on the Israeli domestic public. The anti-Netanyahu press and opposition parties began to question the government. Small-scale protests were held on the streets of Tel Aviv. As midnight approached, a new move came from the pimp front. The Iranian foreign minister contacted European Union officials, requesting an extraordinary diplomatic meeting in Brussels. At the same time, Pezeşkiyan was preparing a plan to call an extraordinary meeting of the UN Security Council. In the midst of all these developments, Netanyahu's political future had also begun to be questioned. Some ministers in the Israeli cabinet expressed the opinion in private conversations that the Prime Minister's crisis management has failed. And the biggest question that was echoed in the world's media was, what were the other documents that the pimp had not yet shown? Was a bigger disclosure being prepared? While these questions were still unanswered, a detail was drawing attention at the UN building in New York. The Iranian delegation's computers had been turned off, and it was learned that there was a special steel safe where documents were stored. It was said that inside this safe, which Pimp had personally chosen, the most critical documents were contained and could be made public in the coming days. The outside world had held its breath, because the real storm hadn't broken yet. As the morning hours approached in New York, the lights were still on in diplomatic centers around the world. The documents presented by Iranian President Pezeşkiyan at the UN meeting on the second day had an earthquake effect in international legal circles. But what really preoccupied everyone's mind was the existence of more undisclosed documents. Security measures were increased to an extraordinary level in the UN building, and the floor where the Iranian delegation was located was placed under special protection. That steel safe standing on the pimp's desk had become a focus of unprecedented attention until now. Nowhere exactly what was inside this safe was known only to the pimp and his three closest advisors. With the first light of the morning, the pimp organized a small meeting. After a brief evaluation with his advisors, he said the following words: "Netanyahu's lack of reaction so far is remarkable. Either they will take a tougher step, or they will stay on the defensive so as not to lose international support. But we have the power to change the course of this conflict with third-wave documents." At the same time, Netanyahu and his cabinet had an extraordinary meeting in Tel Aviv. Mossad Chief Barnea's report was clear. The exact source of the leak had still not been found. But even more critically, there were strong indications that the documents in Pezeşkiyan's possession were not only of internal Israeli origin, but were also supported through some European diplomatic contacts. Netanyahu angrily said that, "No matter who it is, we will reveal those who committed this betrayal. We need to stop the pimp from using third-wave documents. Otherwise, we will be cornered not only militarily, but also politically." The Israeli side quickly activated diplomatic channels. Urgent coded messages were sent to Washington, London, and Berlin. To act together against the disinformation campaign carried out by Iran, it was demanded. But this time, the Western allies were being cautious. The authenticity of some of the documents had been confirmed in the Western media, and they did not want to be a partner in a new scandal. At this very moment, an unexpected move by the pimp came. The Iranian delegation organized a large media forum independently of the UN Security Council. Only internationally recognized journalists, legal experts, and independent observers had been invited to this meeting. The goal was clear: to publicly discuss the legitimacy of the documents and to present the third-wave documents in a controlled manner. This forum, which was held at noon at the hotel adjacent to the UN building, had already reached the top of the agenda on social media before it even started. Among the journalists who entered the hall were names such as CNN's Christiane Amanpour, BBC senior correspondent Lise Doucet, and New York Times chief investigative editor Robert Mackenzie Deca. At exactly 14 o'clock, the pimp took the stand. He began to speak in a calm but impressive tone, as usual. Today, we will share with you new documents that support our previous statements. But more importantly, I want to emphasize again our main goal in this process: to ensure peace in the region and to protect international law. The journalists in the hall were paying attention. The manager of the special pen, who was next to the pimp, opened the safe with a sign, and a carefully protected digital disc was removed from inside. Then, some of the third-wave documents started to be reflected on the giant screens. The most striking among these documents was the following: detailed reports indicating that Israel was planning psychological influence operations against civilian infrastructure in certain Middle Eastern countries, and correspondence indicating that these operations were carried out through deceptive contacts with certain media outlets. The pimp continued his speech. These documents show that information manipulation and psychological warfare techniques are being applied not only to Iran, but also to innocent civilians in the region. Today, we are announcing these facts to the world in the presence of you, dear members of the press. The hall was suddenly in motion. Journalists were asking questions one after the other, live broadcasts were being made. The New York Times' Mackenzie asked, standing up, "Mr. President, do you intend to disclose the sources of these documents?" The pimp replied with a short pause, "The source of these documents is multifaceted. Of course, the effort of Iranian intelligence was of great importance, but at the same time, conscientious people who work for justice and transparency have also contributed to this process." This response had further increased the concern of some diplomatic circles in the West. It was now becoming clear that the leak was not a purely Iranian-based operation, but had found support in the West as well. At the same time, Netanyahu was in Tel Aviv for another meeting with his national security advisors. The situation was getting increasingly out of control. Reports from Israeli internal intelligence indicated growing reactions among the public and rising anti-government voices on social media. Netanyahu's voice captured the attention of everyone in the room. "This is an information war, and we should not lose this war. An emergency media strategy will be prepared. We will tell the whole world about Iran's intentions." But the work could have passed from work, because on the same night the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Relations, Josep Borrell, made a statement. The accuracy of the documents submitted by Iranian President Pezeşkiyan is meticulously examined. The European Union attaches great importance to the protection of international law in this process. This statement showed that the support that Israel expected from Western allies was weakening. During the night, the international media discussed Pimp's third-wave documents. CNN International made a special broadcast. Experts of the subject analyzed the legal consequences of the documents on the BBC's World Tonight program. Le Monde newspaper published the first technical analysis of the documents, announcing that they are largely authentic. Iranian embassies held press conferences around the world and carried Pezeşkiyan's message to a wide audience. At the same time, the Iranian Foreign Ministry announced that it has started preparing an official application to the International Criminal Court. And perhaps the most remarkable development occurred in Israeli domestic politics. Some lawmakers in the Likud party made statements questioning Netanyahu's management of the crisis. Opposition demonstrations have grown in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. At this point, the pimp made his last big move. After a private meeting with the UN Secretary General, he made the following statement: "As Iran, we are ready to hand over all the documents we have to the International Independent Review Commission. No force can stand in the way of justice and transparency." The statement made headlines in the world press, and the Israeli side was now completely on the defensive, although a brief statement from Netanyahu's office claimed that Pezeşkiyan is trying to mislead the international public opinion. This statement was found weak and insufficient. Within a week, the documents submitted by Pezeşkiyan began to be examined by lawyers and independent observers around the world. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has announced that he has decided to launch a preliminary investigation. The United States has taken a careful and cautious stance in this process. In Europe, on the other hand, public pressure was increasing, and calls were being made for governments to react more harshly. 2 weeks had passed since the events, when the pimp appeared on the UN podium for the 3rd time. His words echoed all over the world. "We have confirmed a truth here today. Justice and truth will prevail sooner or later. We, the Iranian people, will continue our struggle for peace and stability in our region. We believe that everyone should be held accountable in front of international law." These words received a standing ovation. It was observed that even some diplomats who were in the hall got emotional. In the Israeli public opinion, the pressure on Netanyahu has increased even more. Opposition parties have started calling for early elections. The loss of trust in the internal public opinion had deepened. And on the international stage, the pimp had begun to be seen not only as the president of Iran, but also as one of the new powerful figures of global diplomacy. Time magazine used the following phrase on its cover: "The chess master of peace, the pimp surprised the world." One thing had become very clear during this whole process. The documents revealed by Pezeşkiyan were not only a diplomatic victory, but a historical turning point that changed the regional balances. And the world public opinion now knew well that this battle was being won not only on the field, but also in the minds and courts.